I want you. The hoarse whisper made Naomi Carter freeze. A black widow, 3 years buried in grief after the deaths of her husband and daughter, now trembled in the arms of Elias Morgan, the drifter, who had collapsed at her cabin door in the snowstorm. Firelight flickered, casting gold across his face, his calloused hand closing tight around hers, his breath burning against her skin. A fierce kiss broke through, tearing down the frozen walls she had built around her heart. After so many lonely winters, Naomi shook with life again. But that storm-tossed night, was it a rebirth, or the beginning of another coming tempest? The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded beast, its icy blades lashing against the cabin walls. The small hut where Naomi Carter lived shook under the storm, the cracks in the door whistling like a mourner's cry. The Black Widow, 42 years old, wrapped an old shawl tighter around her shoulders and stood still before the frost-blurred window. For 3 winters, she had endured alone. Her husband, Samuel, lay beneath the hill after a fall from his horse. Their little daughter had died earlier from fever. On the mantel, the picture of father and child looked down beneath a layer of dust. Naomi survived by growing vegetables, trading eggs for flour, carrying water from the well. But tonight, the storm was fiercer than ever. She laid the last pieces of wood onto the fire. If the flames died, the cold would kill her faster than loneliness. Wrapped in blankets, Naomi sat down, the needle trembling in her hand. She stitched just to keep silence at bay. Through the roar of the wind came another sound. She jerked upright. A knock, faint, yet clear. The needle slipped to the floorboards. Her heart pounded, blood rushing hot to her face. Who could it be? What decent soul would stray into such a night? Or was it bandits, drunkards? The knock came again, more urgent, a groan breaking through the gale. Naomi reached for her husband's Winchester. The wooden stock was icy in her hand. She shouted above the storm, "Who's there?" No clear answer, only a moan tangled with the wind. She lifted the latch and peered through the crack. The wind struck her face. Outside, a man slumped on the threshold. His coat was torn and blood-stained, his left shoulder soaked dark, hair frozen stiff, lips pale. The man lifted his head, ash-gray eyes fading. He forced out words, "Please, help me," then collapsed. Naomi froze. The scene was both trap and plea. If she opened the door, she could lose everything. But if she left him, he would die on her steps. Her heart wrenched. Memories surged, bandaging Samuel's wounds, holding her fevered child. Compassion, buried deep beneath the grave, rose again. She shouted through the door, "If you mean to trick me, you'll die before you cross this threshold." The man staggered upright, swayed back a step. His boots sank in snow, body reeling. Naomi lowered the gun, her throat tight. A whisper broke loose. "Lord have mercy." She pulled the bar. The door flew open, wind rushing in, toppling the lantern's flame. The man fell forward, shuddering. Naomi caught his ice-cold arm and dragged him inside. The door slammed shut, barring the storm. In the wavering light, she saw his face clearly. Past 30, rough stubble, sun-darkened skin of a man long on the trail. His shoulder torn open, blood-soaking cloth. His breath came ragged, skin cold and pale. Naomi stood panting, rifle still within reach. The small room filled with his labored breaths. She watched him for a long moment, then whispered, as if binding herself with the words, "You will not die out there." She knelt, pulling the stranger closer to the fire. Outside, the wind screamed. But inside the cabin, beneath the flickering light, Naomi Carter knew her quiet life had just been changed forever. Elias Morgan collapsed on the wooden floor, breath ragged and broken. Snow clung to his hair and cloak, melting into rivulets that mixed with blood. Naomi knelt beside him, hands trembling yet resolute. She knew hesitation would mean death the cold, and the wound would claim him soon enough. She laid the rifle within reach, then carefully pulled his coat aside. Bright red blood had soaked his left shoulder, dripping down his arm. Naomi clenched her teeth, dragging the oil lamp closer to see the gash. A knife had cut deep, tearing flesh, though by grace it had missed the bone. She fetched whiskey and old bandages from the wooden chest. She had once tended Samuel's injuries, kicks from horses, cuts from work with blades. The motions returned, practiced and steady, though her heart thundered. When the whiskey touched raw flesh, Elias let out a muffled groan. His body tensed, gray eyes flickering open through fever's haze. Then, in his delirium, his hand shot out and clutched Naomi's wrist. The sudden strength startled her, needle slipping from her grasp. She nearly pulled away, but that warm, trembling grip clung as though to life itself. She froze. Her chest heaved, her pulse racing. How long had it been since anyone touched her? 3 years, since Samuel's death. The grip weakened, loosened, then fell away. Elias collapsed back, unconscious once more. Naomi bent close, bound the bandage tight around his shoulder, knotting it firm. When she finished, she studied his face. The harsh lines spoke of years lived beneath sun and wind. A man weathered by the trail. She dragged him onto the cabin's only bed. The old cotton mattress, long steeped in the scent of smoke, now bore a stranger's weight. She pulled a blanket over him, lingered longer than she meant to, then sighed and gathered the soiled rags to wash quickly. That night, Naomi did not take the bed. She pulled a chair close to the fire, wrapped herself in shawls. The lamp burned out, leaving only the red glow of coals, painting wavering shadows across the ceiling. From the bed came the heavy rhythm of another's breath. Naomi sat still, listening to each rise and fall, and felt her own heart steady. For 3 years this cabin had held only her breathing. Tonight, another rhythm filled it, foreign yet shifting the air completely. She remembered the last evening Samuel was alive. He sat in that very chair, pulling off dust-caked boots, smiling with weariness. Now she sat there alone, clutching a blanket. Yet, instead of emptiness, she felt something new, unfamiliar. Not safety, not peace, but life. Each time Elias stirred, Naomi's ears caught it. She stayed wary, not knowing who he was, where he came from, or what danger he might bring. Yet she could not deny the truth. Her heart was no longer locked in ice. The stranger's breathing reached into the hollow corners of her world, pushing back the silence that had haunted her for so long. Naomi rested her head against the chair. Outside, the snowstorm raged and screamed, but inside the worn cabin, in the glow of coals and the sound of 2 breaths mingling, Naomi Carter knew one simple truth. She was no longer entirely alone. The snowstorm did not ease as Naomi had hoped. Instead, it raged on, day after day, swallowing the little cabin in a blinding shroud of white. Each morning, Naomi cracked the door open, only to have the wind lash her face and force her to slam it shut. Both of them understood. The cabin became their whole world. Beyond its walls lay nothing but frozen void. Elias was mending. Under Naomi's steady hands, the wound in his left shoulder had begun to knit. The bleeding slowed. He could sit upright now, even walk a few steps, though with a limp. Every movement still drew a wince, yet his eyes no longer looked clouded. When Naomi handed him a bowl of hot broth, Elias's hands shook as he took it, his gaze lingering on her thin, work-worn fingers longer than it should have. "Thank you." His voice was rough, but stronger. Naomi pressed her lips, gave a small nod. She stayed cautious, yet could not deny the man's presence had broken the emptiness that ruled her life. The cabin now carried sound, the clink of a spoon against a bowl, the shift of footsteps, the rhythm of 2 breaths. Each small noise startled Naomi, as though the wooden room itself had found its soul again. On the second afternoon, while the gale clawed at the walls, Elias offered to mend the quilt whose edge had torn. He sat under the lamp, awkwardly threading needle through cloth, his broad hands clumsy. Naomi let out a laugh, soft and sudden. The rare sound rang in the cabin, and both of them stilled. Elias looked up, gray eyes alight, as if he wished to hold that smile. Naomi turned away quickly, her heart hammering. That night the storm roared on. The cabin quivered beneath each blast. Elias wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, then murmured, "You should take the bed. I'll sleep in the chair." Naomi studied him. His face was still pale, lips cracked. He was far from strong. She exhaled. "In this cold, you're not fit for the chair. If you must, take the bed too. It's wide enough to share." The words thickened the air. Elias was silent for a long moment before nodding once. They lay down, each turned to the other side. Naomi pressed her back against the wooden wall, trying to keep distance. Yet warmth seeped from Elias, carrying the scent of smoke and the trail. His breathing filled the hush. Naomi shut her eyes tight, chest pounding. One turn and she would touch him. The thought held her rigid. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, silence thundered louder still. At last Naomi slipped into sleep. When faint light crept through the shutters next morning, she stirred and froze. Her cheek rested on Elias's chest. His arm lay draped over her shoulder, loose, yet enclosing her in warmth. Naomi's body locked, her heart racing. She had not been held like this since Samuel's passing. Elias slept on, breath steady. Naomi dared not move. She only closed her eyes again, feigning slumber, waiting. At length he shifted. Realizing the closeness, he withdrew his arms slowly, rose without a word, and crossed to the hearth. She heard the crackle of kindling, the soft thud of wood laid on fire. Naomi opened her eyes a slit, her pulse still uneven. In that moment, she knew the walls around her heart had cracked, not by words, but by an unthinking arm in the night. The third day unfolded with a different rhythm. When Naomi passed Elias a bowl of porridge, her fingers brushed his. The touch was brief, yet their eyes caught and held a second too long. Later, when he tugged the blanket up over her shoulders, she tilted her head aside, but warmth lingered within her. 3 days trapped by snow, and they spoke more than Naomi had believed she could. She told him of Samuel, of the little girl. Her voice was steady, as if reading from an old page. But Elias listened with grave silence, never breaking in. When he spoke of his own life, 17 in uniform, years roaming with horses and the trail, Naomi sat still, as though a foreign land had opened before her. By the third night, the storm began to wane outside. Yet inside Naomi, another storm was only beginning. She knew with certainty one turn closer, and the world itself would change. The morning after the storm, pale light slipped through the cracks of the door, washing the wooden floor in muted gray. The air was still cold, yet the cabin no longer felt the same. 2 breaths mingled. 2 voices, awkward but warm, echoed where silence had long reigned. Elias could move with less strain. The wound had not yet healed, but he managed to reach the hearth. When Naomi bent to stoke the fire, he stopped her, his voice low yet firm. "Today, let me cook. Don't look at me as if I'm useless." Naomi arched a brow. A wounded stranger wanting to cook? But as she watched him roll up his sleeves, fumbling with pots, coaxing the flames with clumsy patience, a soft laugh escaped her. Elias turned, gray eyes alight at the sound. For the first time in years, Naomi heard her own laughter. Plain, brief, yet it cracked through the ice like spring water breaking stone. He made a simple stew from dry beans and the last scraps of vegetables. When he set the bowl before her, his eyes waited, tense as a man before judgment. Naomi tasted slowly. The flavor was plain, but not poor. Her lips pressed into a smile as she said softly, "It's good." Elias exhaled, shoulders dropping as if a battle had ended. He laughed, and that laughter, joined with her smile, filled the cabin with warmth. A meal had never held so much sound. In the days that followed, the cabin seemed altered. Elias busied himself mending the squeaking chair, tightening the door, feeding the fire. Naomi found herself watching each movement, knowing without him the cabin would have remained a hollow shell. In return, each time she changed his bandage, her hands trembled faintly at the feel of his skin. It was no longer only duty, it was nerves, quickened breath, a pulse she could not calm. That afternoon, as Naomi bent to wrap fresh cloth around his shoulder, Elias suddenly caught her hand and pressed it against his chest. His heart beat strong beneath the warmth of skin. Naomi startled, eyes wide, ready to pull back, but he shook his head gently. With his other hand he brushed aside the stray hair falling across her face. His voice quivered, yet carried a plea. "Let me look at you more clearly. Please." Naomi raised her gaze. Their eyes met, neither turning away. For a breath, time stopped. Elias leaned closer, lips trembling. He whispered an apology, then pressed his mouth to hers. Naomi stiffened, startled, but did not push him away. Her eyes drifted shut, letting the warmth of him flow in. His kiss was unpracticed, tasting of salt and smoke, but it held a raw honesty, the hunger of a man long denied. His tongue brushed, tentative, careful not to wound. Naomi shivered, yet yielded, letting the moment carry her. The kiss was not long, but when they drew apart, the cabin thrummed with a new pulse of life. Naomi touched her lips, dazed. Elias sat silent, gaze filled with longing and fear. I'm sorry," he whispered. "I couldn't stop myself." Naomi lowered her face, cheeks burning. Yet no anger came. A smile, faint and shy, curved her mouth. Words were not needed. Both knew a line had been crossed. The cabin, once a hollow box of silence, now rang with laughter, whispers, and the steady beat of two hearts. A bond had been born, fragile and wordless, but strong enough to alter everything. After that hurried kiss, the cabin fell into silence. Neither spoke again. Naomi pulled her hand back. Elias stepped away, both as though they had stumbled into a land neither dared to claim. In the days that followed, they behaved as if nothing had passed between them. Elias told fewer trail stories. Naomi bent longer over her stitching. The clink of spoon against bowl, the whistle of wind outside all filled the spaces, but none erased the tension. At last, the blizzard began to fade. The wind softened, the sky torn with streaks of silver light. When Naomi opened the door, the first sun in days poured in, chasing out the stale air. Yet in that brightness she felt the truth. When the storm ended, Elias would go. That afternoon he stood by the hearth, fingering the dry coat. His voice came low, steady but forced. "Perhaps I should leave. I don't wish to trouble you further." Naomi bowed her head, hiding her face in her shawl. A hollow ache twisted through her chest. She longed to say, "Stay," yet her throat was locked. "You are well enough now," was all she managed, her voice thick. Elias nodded, eyes fixed on the window where snow thinned into slush. After a long pause, he drew something from his pocket, a small carving of a sparrow, wings spread, rough, yet sturdy. He set it in Naomi's palm. "A thank you for saving me. I have little else, just the work of idle hands along the road." Naomi studied the tiny bird, her fingers trembling over its lines. She closed it within her hand, yet no words rose to hold him. When she lifted her gaze, their eyes met. His hand found hers, squeezed once. In that moment, both knew much remained unspoken, but one still bound to the graves of husband and child. The other, fearing his presence might bring her burden, neither crossed the line. Their hands slipped apart, slowly, as if letting go of something precious. Elias pulled on his coat. The door opened, a draft sweeping in with the scent of thawing snow. He looked back once, gave a quiet nod, then stepped out. Naomi stood on the porch, watching his tall frame fade into silver mist. His tracks trailed across the snow until distance swallowed them whole. When he was gone, Naomi returned inside, The cabin sank into its old silence, but heavier now. Once, solitude was all she had known. Now, having tasted laughter, presence, the warmth of another's arm, her loneliness had doubled. She sank into the armchair, her hand tightening around the wooden sparrow. Outside, the wind was still. But within her heart, a new storm had only just begun. Naomi believed he would never return. After the morning Elias walked away, the cabin sank back into its old silence. The fire in the hearth could not fill the empty chair where he once whittled wood. She sat for hours clutching the carved sparrow, listening to the wind scrape along the eaves. Her heart weighted heavy. The next afternoon, as Naomi bent to stir the fire, a faint knock sounded. Her chest tightened. She opened the door and Elias stood there, snow on his shoulders, gray eyes lit with a shy light. "If you don't mind," he cleared his throat, gripping the brim of his hat, "I'd ask to stay a while longer." Naomi laughed, soft as spring's first breeze. All the tension inside her broke loose. That night, they sat by the fire. Elias was silent for a long time before confessing, "The truth is, I couldn't bear to go. My mind was nothing but you. I stepped out that door and realized I'd left my heart behind in this house." Naomi lowered her head. His words toppled the walls she had spent years building. Her voice trembled, raw. "When you were gone, the house was lonelier than ever." The words spilled out, light yet heavy as release. They looked at one another, eyes locked in the glow of flames. All the restraint of days past melted. Elias reached for her hand. This time Naomi did not pull away. His rough fingers wove into hers, holding fast. Slowly, they leaned closer. The kiss that followed was no fleeting touch. It deepened, fierce, consuming. His lips sought, demanded. Hers answered, hesitant at first, then swept away in the tide. Naomi felt blood surge through her. Each nerve quickened back to life. They broke only for breath, then found each other again. Between the pauses, Elias whispered, "I want you, all of you. Not pity, not kindness. You whole." Naomi closed her eyes and nodded. For years, she had buried herself in grief, believing her heart dead. Now, she found herself again, not as a widow, draped in mourning, but as a woman of flesh, desiring and desired. Elias lifted her, laid her on the bed. Naomi's hair spilled across the pillow, her eyes wide in the fire's glow. His lips trailed her throat, her shoulder, each kiss burning. Naomi trembled, breath breaking. When his hands searched, she whispered not to refuse, but to affirm, "I want this." In that moment their bodies joined, closing the distance, breaking the years of solitude. No barriers remained, no hesitation, only pounding hearts, tangled breath, the fierce grip of need. Naomi felt every touch, every embrace, every sound escaping her own lips. In his arms, she was remade. The winters of loss, the long cold nights all dissolved into warmth. Elias held her tight, whispering over and over, "You're beautiful. You're alive. You're loved. You are mine." Naomi shut her eyes, tears sliding, but these were tears of rebirth. For the first time in years, she was woman again, longed for, cherished, alive in the fullness of the moment. That night, the cabin ceased to be a house of mourning. It blazed with the breath of two souls, two bodies, finding each other in the dark, clinging like a flame to the winter wind. When dawn crept through the cracks, Naomi stirred. Elias lay beside her, his arm draped across her shoulder, his breath warm against her hair. She turned gently, studied the face still resting in sleep. A smile spread across her lips, slow and certain. That night they had given more than bodies, they had given back the truth that hearts can beat again. After that night, the cabin wore a new skin. Each morning Naomi woke to see Elias stoking the fire or stacking wood by the hearth, and the silence that once pressed on her chest was gone. Their glances, their fleeting smiles, they were a secret kept between the two of them. But secrets on this frontier rarely stayed hidden long. One noon, with snow melting from the eaves, Elias led his horse across the open ground. They thought no one would notice, yet the hoofprints on the road toward Dry Creek drew watchful eyes. A few tracks were all it took for rumors to stir. When Naomi went to market that Saturday morning, the change met her at the door. Conversation fell silent, replaced by sideways looks. She quietly chose flour, salt, but the whispers behind her rose just loud enough to hear. Look there, man's horse tied at her woods. 3 years a widow, and now visitors come calling. Naomi drew a steady breath, holding her composure. At the counter, Mrs. Morrison, the sharp-tongued woman whose words always cut, narrowed her eyes. Hard times like these, I reckon a little help makes it easier, don't it? Naomi lifted her gaze. Though her heart trembled, her gray eyes held firm. I manage on my own, and if someone knocks at your door in a storm, I'd think a true Christian wouldn't leave it barred. The reply made a few heads bow, yet it could not still the tide of whispers. Naomi paid, turned, and walked out, her hand clenched tight beneath the shawl. Each step from the store felt like treading thorns. Outside, the wind had softened, but the chill within her weighed heavier. Since Elias had stayed, Naomi had dared to believe she was alive again. Yet in this land, a black woman widowed was not easily granted peace to find happiness. That afternoon, Naomi sat on the porch, her eyes lost on the horizon. Elias returned and read the strain upon her face. He did not question, only laid his calloused hand on her shoulder. That touch alone nearly brought her to tears. They've begun to talk, she whispered, voice shaking. About the tracks, about you. Elias's grip tightened, his gaze steady. Let me carry it with you. You've borne too much alone. Naomi pressed her lips together. Fear still churned inside, yet deep down she knew for the first time in years she did not stand alone against the weight of judgment. That night the cabin held no laughter, as in days before, but in the dark, their breaths mingled, a silent vow that together they would weather the whispers beyond their door. In the days after the whispers spread through town, Naomi scarcely stepped beyond her porch. The cabin had returned to quiet, but it was no longer peace. The silence now felt like a cage, tight, airless, pressing in. She knew she had changed, and the world beyond those walls knew it too. Yet instead of joy, only tension pressed heavy on her chest. Elias tried to ease the weight. He told trail tales, tried to joke about a companion who once mistook soap for cheese, but Naomi's smile came strained. Her gaze often drifted far off, and Elias understood much as he wished. He could not lift all the burden inside her. One afternoon, as Naomi pinned laundry in the yard, hoofbeats sounded. She turned and saw a familiar figure. Martha Collins, a widow a few years older. Martha ran the boarding house in Dry Creek. Known for her blunt ways and quiet kindness, perhaps no one in town understood the loneliness of widowhood better. Naomi wiped damp hands on her apron and welcomed her inside. Martha set a loaf of fresh bread on the table, its warm scent filling the kitchen. They sat across from one another. For a long moment, Martha simply studied her friend. "You're different, Naomi," she said at last, her tone slow, steady. Naomi frowned slightly. Different? How? Leaning on the table, Martha tilted her head. All these years, I saw only a woman bent down, thin, eyes lost in fog. But now I see light on your face. Naomi gave a nervous laugh, waving it aside. I'm the same, Martha. Only, there's someone to talk to, that's all. Don't dodge me, Martha cut in, her hand firm in the air. Everyone sees it. Elias, that man's brought breath back into this cabin. The town may never hold its tongue, but I see something else. Naomi lowered her eyes, fingers laced tightly in her lap. Martha's words pressed through the defenses Naomi had built. You've lived in the shadow of Samuel and the child too long, Martha said, voice sharp yet gentle. I know how deep that wound goes. But Naomi, They are gone. You're still here, with breath in your lungs, a heart that still beats. Living as you have these years is not remembrance. It's burying yourself alive beside them. Tears welled in Naomi's eyes. Her voice rasped. But if I step forward, is it not betrayal of Samuel and Emma? I still see them everywhere. Martha reached across the table, grasping her friend's hand. Betrayal? No, Naomi. Betrayal is letting your heart wither while you still breathe. Samuel loved you, Emma too. Do you think they'd want to watch you fade away each day? Number. They'd want you to find peace. Naomi trembled, shoulders shaking as tears slid down. Martha stayed, steady as a sister, letting her weep. After a while, Martha spoke again. Slower, gentler. Elias isn't perfect, no one island, I don't know what shadows he carries. But I've seen his eyes when he looks at you. That's not a user's gaze. That's the look of a man who's found salvation in you, just as you've found in him. Naomi sat silent, her heart storming. For days she had known only sharp tongues, cutting looks. For the first time, someone spoke with understanding, not judgment. Martha's words tapped against the door of a heart long locked. Naomi, Martha said at last, her voice firm as stone. Don't let fear of the past cage you forever. Live true to your heart. Naomi managed only a nod, throat too tight for words. They sat together a while longer, the fire snapping softly in the hearth. At length Martha rose, brushed flour from her skirts, and offered a fleeting smile. I've chores enough at the boarding house. But remember what I said. Naomi walked her to the porch, watching as Martha's figure faded down the dusty road. She stood still, cradling the warm loaf against her chest. Back inside, Naomi sank to the table. Her eyes fell to the carved wooden sparrow Elias had left. Fingers trembling, she traced the rough wings. Martha's voice echoed. Don't let the fear of the past cage you. Outside, dusk spread red across the horizon. Naomi drew a deep breath. Her heart beat differently now, not only with fear, but with the faint stir of hope, like a green shoot breaking through hard earth. For the first time in years, she felt she might be ready to listen to herself. After Martha left that day, Naomi sat by the window for a long while. The sky blazed red with sunset, wind slipping cold through the cracks. Yet her chest burned as though a small flame had been kindled. Martha's words cut deep. Don't let fear of the past cage you. Live true to your heart. But even as Naomi drifted between past and present, Elias came to her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, his eyes more solemn than she had ever seen. Naomi. His voice was low and firm. I've been thinking. Here, they'll never stop talking. You've borne enough gossip already. I don't want my presence to bring you more suffering. Naomi lifted her face, startled. What are you saying? I'll go. Elias drew a long breath. I've heard the southern town needs men to work with horses. I could find a place there, build a new life, and, if you wish, when I'm settled, I'll return for you. Somewhere else, you won't be the name they whisper behind closed doors. Naomi's throat tightened, her hand clutching at her shawl. She wanted to cry out, "Don't leave," but no sound came. Samuel's face, Emma's laughter, their memories haunted every plank of this cabin. Samuel had built it. Emma had played in its corners. How could she walk away so easily? Elias read the conflict in her eyes. He did not reproach her. He only bent, pressed a brief kiss to her brow, and stepped onto the porch. When his figure faded down the road, the cabin sank into silence. Yet this silence was no longer familiar, it was hollow, a gap carved deep, leaving Naomi aching with loneliness. In the days that followed, she moved like a shadow, lighting fires, washing, hanging clothes, chores performed by rote. But at night, seated alone by the hearth, Naomi would reach for the small wooden sparrow he had carved, her chest swelling with a grief she could not quiet. The cabin had been silent for years, yet never had it felt so empty. One afternoon, early, spring melting snow on the hills. Naomi was drawing water from the well when a rider approached. The mail carrier called her name and handed her a creased envelope sealed with plain wax. Her hands trembled as she broke it open. Inside, rough but steady handwriting stretched across the page. Naomi, I hope this letter finds you in health and peace. I've come to Fort Laramie and found work with the cavalry horses. It's hard, but steady. Here, no one minds the past, nor do they whisper about you. They judge only how a man works, how he carries himself. Naomi, I don't write to demand, only to offer a choice. If you wish, come here. The town needs a school teacher, and I know they'll value you for who you are, not the words of gossips. I can't promise wealth, but I can promise a life of quiet, where your heart can be its true self. However you choose, I'll remain grateful for the night you opened your door in the storm. Without it, I wouldn't be alive to write this. Elias Morgan. Naomi read the letter 3 times, her heart pounding like a girl's. The crude lines carried something she had not felt in years, a door opening to the future. Yet with hope came fear. If she left this place, would it not betray Samuel and Emma, resting on the hill behind the cabin? Their graves marked by wooden crosses, the fields where her daughter's steps once fell. The walls Samuel had built, were they not her lifeline through the years? To abandon it, was that to deny the life she had clung to? Naomi sat for hours by the window, letter in hand, eyes unfocused on the horizon. The spring wind slipped through the cracks, gentler than winter's bite, yet her spirit swayed as if caught in storm. That night, she set the letter beside the wooden sparrow. 2 small tokens lay side by side, like voices whispering. One pulled her backward, into memory. The other beckoned forward, into what might be. Naomi closed her eyes, listening to her heartbeat. It was quick, uneven, no longer the steady rhythm of resignation. Perhaps it had always lived, waiting only to be awakened. The question loomed, sharp as the prairie wind. Naomi Carter, will you go on burying yourself in the dark, or will you turn the page to something new? That morning the sky was strangely clear. After weeks of gloom, the first light of spring poured across the gray fields, melting the last patches of snow into thin rivulets. Naomi wrapped her worn shawl tight, Elias's letter clutched in hand. She had not slept through the night. His words still burned in her mind. I cannot promise you wealth, but I can promise a life of quiet, where your heart can be itself. She knew it was time to face the past, not in memory, but where it lay in the earth. Slowly, Naomi walked the familiar path up the hill behind the cabin. She had traced these steps for years, week after week. But today was different. Each step felt heavy, for she knew this time she had not come only to lay wildflowers, she had come to speak the most important words of her life. At the crest stood 2 wooden markers, one tall, one small. Samuel's headboard had faded, the carved letters worn thin by years. On Emma's grave, a dried stem bent against the wind. Naomi knelt, her trembling hand stroking the rough wood, the touch as familiar as flesh once was. Samuel, Emma, her voice broke. All these years I came here only to say I was still alive, that I kept the cabin, tended the fire, survived the winters. But the truth is, I have only survived, nothing more. Tears fell, soaking into the damp soil. Naomi bent low, chest tightening, as if squeezed by unseen hands. My love, she whispered to Samuel. From the day you left, I built walls around myself. I thought if I lived inside memory, I would keep you near. But I only made myself a shadow. I forgot what it meant to be seen, to be touched, to laugh. Her eyes shifted to the small mound. Her hand trembled on the earth. My sweet girl, forgive me. I could not save you from the fever. Since you left, I told myself one thing over and over. If I dared to be glad, if I dared to love, would that mean I had forgotten you? I was so afraid, I hardly allowed myself to breathe. The Spring wind stirred her gray hair. For a moment she felt it not in words, but in presence, as if the ground itself whispered. A gentleness seeped into her chest, loosening what had long been bound. Naomi drew Elias's letter and unfolded it. The breeze lifted the lines, words flickering in the light. "There is a man who came to the cabin in the storm," she said softly. "He is not perfect, he bears wounds as I do. But when I look into his eyes, I feel alive again. I hear my own heart beating. Samuel, I do not want to betray you. I do not want to forget Emma. But I cannot keep on only existing." Her breath hitched. She went on. "I ask your blessing to step forward, not to replace, but to find myself again. My love for you both will never fade, but it will no longer be chains. I want it to be wings, to lift me into a new life." Closing her eyes, she whispered, "Give me courage. Give me a sign that I am not wrong to choose life." At that instant, a gust rose, scattering dry petals from Emma's grave into the air. They spun upward, caught in the sunlight. Naomi opened her eyes, and for a heartbeat it felt as if someone smiled at her from afar. She stayed long on the hill. The sun grew warmer, snow melting into streams down the slope. With each moment, the ice around her heart cracked, little by little. At last, she rose. Looking down at the two graves, she gave a small nod. "Thank you. I will never forget. But I will not let grief drown me any longer." Descending the hill, Naomi saw the cabin below, bathed in new light. It was still the same old dwelling, yet in her eyes, it no longer looked like a prison. It was the place that had kept her alive, and now, the place she was ready to leave, so she might truly live. That night Naomi set Elias's letter and the wooden sparrow side by side on the table. The lamp flame threw their shadows together across the wall. She touched them, a quiet smile softening her face. For the first time in all years, she did not feel she was betraying the past. She felt she was being honest with the present. Naomi knew that come morning, she would begin to gather her things. The road ahead would be strange, unfamiliar, but within her, the answer was already clear. On the morning Naomi chose to leave, the early spring sun spread evenly across the cabin roof, painting the cracked wood as if with a new shade. She stood still in the kitchen, eyes sweeping every corner she had known. The worn armchair, the faded curtain, the table Samuel once built. Each piece bore memory, but instead of pulling her back, they seemed now to nod in farewell. Naomi packed only a little. She carried with her what mattered most: the photograph of Samuel holding Emma, his stern eyes beside the child's bright smile. The rag doll once clutched in her daughter's small hands. A torn, leather-bound Bible, its pages yellowed with age. And lastly, the wooden sparrow Elias had carved, its wings spread wide like a promise. These four relics filled nearly all the space in her small trunk. The rest was just a few dresses, some shawls, and her sewing kit. She locked the cabin door one last time and lifted her gaze to the hill behind, where two graves lay quiet under sunlight. Her heart pinched, but the weight no longer chained her. "I will carry your love with me," she whispered, "and live true to it." The journey took 5 days. Naomi bought passage on a freight wagon, huddled among sacks of flour and barrels of salt. The road jarred her bones, dust mixed with the smell of dry hay. By day she gazed out, watching the endless sweep of grasslands, horses running free in the distance. By night she leaned against a crate, lulled by the steady beat of hooves, letting the cabin fade farther behind her with each mile. When at last the wagon rolled into Fort Laramie, Naomi stared in awe. The town bustled, so unlike small dry creek. The main street was laid with gravel, flanked by shops, boarding houses, saloons. Crowds pressed along the walkways, voices rising in a mix of laughter and barter. The scent of fresh bread mingled with horse dung, forge smoke carried on the clang of hammers. The place throbbed with life, overwhelming and alive. Naomi rented a room in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, run by a stout, hearty woman, with a booming voice. She led Naomi upstairs to a small chamber, a narrow bed of iron, a tiny table, a window looking over the street. Not grand, not spacious, but warm, and enough to begin again. On her first day in town, Naomi sought out the school. It was a plain wooden hall, tin roof, rows of benches set straight. Mr. Reeves, the overseer, peered at her through round spectacles as she explained her past reading, teaching children in Dry Creek's church. After a pause, he nodded. "We need a teacher badly. These children lack guidance. If you're willing, you can start next week." Naomi gripped her shawl, her throat tight, but her eyes shone. "I am willing." That evening, Naomi sat in her small room, watching the street lamps flicker to life below. She heard children laughing, wagons clattering, music drifting from a saloon. It had been years since she felt herself at the heart of such a living place. But with new life came unease. Would the townsfolk accept a black widow as their teacher? Would her past cling like a shadow? Inside her, faith and fear clashed like two streams running against each other. That night she opened her trunk and laid out the 4 keepsakes. The photograph, the doll, the Bible, the sparrow. She set them on the small table by her bed. The lamp cast their shadows together on the wall. One, a family gone, the other, a promise of tomorrow. Naomi touched the sparrow and whispered, "Elias, I've come." In that moment, her spirit eased. She no longer felt like a woman clinging to memory, but like one about to stand before children, to give them words, to find her worth again in letters and lessons. The next day, Naomi walked the marketplace. Strangers glanced her way, but none whispered, none judged. She bought a sack of flour, a few skeins of yarn, and felt her breath come easier. Fort Laramie was not Dry Creek. Here, the past was not a chain. At sunset, she returned to her room, drew the curtain, and sat by the window. She opened a small journal and wrote, "First day in Fort Laramie. I am afraid, but I also hope. Perhaps this is what true living feels like, both trembling and expectant." Her pen stilled. She lifted her eyes, gazing at the street below. Among the passing crowd, she glimpsed for a heartbeat the figure of a man on horseback, broad-shouldered, with gray eyes. Her chest seized, but when she looked again, it was a stranger. Naomi smiled faintly, telling herself, "The day will come. I will see him again." The first weeks in Fort Laramie passed slowly but surely. Naomi stood before the little schoolhouse, her hands trembling at first as she held the chalk. Yet steadiness returned as the children's voices rose together, reciting their letters. Each afternoon, when class dismissed and the children spilled into the yard, Naomi lingered in the sun-filled room, weary, but filled with a quiet joy. She realized her voice was no longer hoarse from silence. It had regained warmth with every lesson spoken. Across town, Elias worked with the cavalry horses. His shoulder still bore the scar, not fully healed, but his hands were sure, practiced with reins and steady when calming the untamed. At first, Naomi only heard news from a distance. Then one evening, as she gathered schoolbooks, a familiar figure stood in the doorway. Elias, dusty from the road, gray eyes softened with light. Naomi froze, heart hammering, then smiled. No words were needed. Their eyes met, and both knew the distance of those days apart had only confirmed what they already carried. They belonged to each other. From that day forward, Naomi and Elias wove their lives together. Each morning she taught while he tended the horses. By afternoon they crossed paths in the marketplace, sometimes walking together down streets washed in sunlight. On weekends, Elias sat whittling bits of wood, carving sparrows for Naomi's students, while she read aloud from well-worn books. The old cabin was far behind them, yet here, in this new town, they built another kind of home, one filled not with silence, but with laughter and shared breath. There were still nights when Naomi startled awake, haunted by Samuel and Emma. Elias said nothing then, only drew her close, his arm a shield of quiet strength. He knew the past could never be erased, but he could offer himself as the steady shoulder she leaned on now. In those embraces, Naomi came to see that this new love was not betrayal. It was continuation, like spring rising. After winter, the town gradually grew used to them. People saw Miss Carter, the teacher, firm but kind. They saw Elias, patient with the horses. The sharp rumors that once swirled began to fade. In their place came respect, the sense that both had carved out a rightful place in the life of Fort Laramie. That spring, Elias asked her to be his wife. There was no diamond, only a plain silver band forged by the blacksmith at the post. He knelt in the small boarding house room, eyes bright and trembling. Naomi's tears came with laughter, her nod carrying both joy and release. They chose a simple wedding. The chapel in the center of town held no grandeur, only a few wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Friends, neighbors, and some of Naomi's pupils stood as witnesses. Naomi wore a modest cream dress with a blue ribbon, a gift from one of her girls. Elias wore a white shirt, scar still visible on his shoulder, but his smile radiant. Hand in hand before the wooden altar, sunlight streamed through the window, bathing their faces. No grandeur, no noise, only truth. Naomi felt her heart open and bloom, not because Samuel and Emma were forgotten, but because she had found the courage to love again, to live fully in the present. After the ceremony, they sat together on the chapel steps. Children's laughter drifted on the breeze, spring winds threading through Naomi's hair. Elias laid his hand on hers, whispering, "You're not just surviving anymore, Naomi. You're living." She leaned against him, eyes brimming. He was right. For years she had walked in shadow, breathing but not alive. This love had opened the locked door of her heart, teaching her that to truly live was not just to draw breath, but to hope, to love, to belong. That spring, Naomi Carter and Elias Morgan began their new journey. Not a grand one, but a life whole, with love built from broken pieces, shaped into something enduring. And in it they proved, true love comes only when the heart dares to open. 1 year after their simple wedding in the small chapel, Naomi and Elias lived in a rhythm warm and steady, plain on the surface yet filled with moments worth more than gold. Naomi still stood before her class, her voice firm as the children read aloud in chorus. Elias still worked among the cavalry horses, his hands calloused but his eyes bright each evening when he saw her waiting at the boarding house porch. Then, one day, Naomi felt a quiet change within. Mornings brought fatigue. Sometimes, she had to sit halfway through a lesson, breath short. At first, she blamed age and work, but as the signs grew clearer, she placed her hand on her belly, and a trembling certainty swept through her. That night, by lamplight, she whispered to Elias, "I think we are going to have another." Elias froze. He stared at her face, eyes wide, then slowly laid his hand over hers. His voice caught, "Naomi, are you sure?" Tears slid down her cheeks, but her lips curved in a smile. "I'm sure." The small room glowed with firelight, and in that moment both knew their lives had turned a page. In the months that followed, Naomi moved slower. Her lively students quickly guessed. Their teacher carried a secret. They brought her wildflowers from the fields, small tokens clutched in little hands. Elias grew fussily attentive, nearly comical. He forbade her from hauling water, claimed even the firewood, tried his hand at cooking, though he burned more pots than not. Naomi laughed, shaking her head. Yet inside she was moved by his clumsy devotion. As her belly swelled, Naomi often sat by the window at night, humming lullabies once sung for Emma. At first, the songs stabbed her with grief, as though betraying memory. But over time, the pain softened, giving way to tenderness. Emma would always live in her heart. This child was not a replacement, but a gift, a second chance offered by life itself. The birth came on a rainy spring night, raindrops drumming on the tin roof of the boarding house. Naomi labored hard, sweat soaking her back. But Elias never let go of her hand. His voice whispered steady at her ear. "You're strong. You can do this. I'm right here." And then the first cry pierced the night, raw and new. Naomi wept, cradling the tiny life in her trembling arms. A son, skin flushed, eyes still closed. Elias sank beside her, his rugged face lit with wonder and joy. "Our little angel," he whispered hoarsely. Naomi gazed down, then up at her husband. "We'll name him Thomas in remembrance." Elias nodded, tears tracing his sun-browned cheek as he gathered both into his arms. From that night on, the room once home to two now rang with new sounds, cries, coos, lullabies. Elias learned to cradle the infant, awkward but patient. He soothed him with tales of horses, while Naomi sang in a voice, softened by years and renewed by hope. The town, too, changed its tone. Where once there were whispers, now there were smiles, small gifts pressed into Naomi's hands for the baby. Many nights Naomi sat rocking Thomas, peace flooding her heart in a way she thought forever lost. The past remained Samuel, Emma, the winters of loneliness. But now, those memories were no longer chains. They had become the soil from which this spring had grown. Elias often lingered on the porch, watching wife and child with a look of disbelief at his own fortune. He would murmur, "I once thought my life was nothing but roaming and shadow. But the night you opened that door in the storm, I learned what home island." Naomi smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And I learned that life is more than survival. Life begins when you dare to love again." That spring, in their modest room in a bustling new town, the three of them began a fresh chapter. No grandeur, no noise, only love enough to fill the walls. And for Naomi, it was the plainest miracle of all. From a widow who had survived the storm, she had become a mother once more, not just alive, but truly living. 3 years after Naomi left Dry Creek, the spring wind once again swept the Wyoming prairie. This time, she did not walk alone. Beside her stood Elias, broad-shouldered, steady as ever, and their little boy, Thomas, taking his first unsteady steps. Naomi knew the time had come to return, not to justify, but to face the past, to show her son his roots, and to give thanks to Samuel and Emma. The wagon rattled along the dusty road back toward town. Naomi sat quietly, Thomas in her arms, her eyes resting on the familiar fields. The land had not changed: the distant blue ridges, the trickling stream, the scattered wooden houses. Yet within her, all was different. Gone was the fear of other people's eyes. What filled her now was calm, born of knowing she had chosen life. When the wagon halted before Morrison's store, Naomi felt the weight of stares gather upon them. Whispers, so familiar, rose again. "Isn't that Naomi Carter? She's back. And with a man and a child?" Naomi drew a deep breath. Elias stepped down first, then lifted her and Thomas with quiet strength. He clasped her hand firmly, his gaze steady, as if to say, "We will face this together." Inside the store, Mrs. Morrison still stood behind the counter. Her hair was grayer, but her eyes just as sharp. She looked at Naomi for a long moment before speaking. "Well, well, after all this time, I heard you left, and now you return with a new husband and a babe." Naomi tightened her hand around Elias's. Once, such words would have shaken her. Now her voice held steady. "I've come back to visit the graves of my husband and daughter. They are still here, and I believe, if Samuel lived, he would want me to find peace." The air in the store grew still. A few heads lowered. Mrs. Morrison opened her mouth, but one look from Elias, firm, unwavering, silenced her. Naomi purchased a small bundle of wildflowers, then led her family up the hill behind the old cabin. The house still stood, weathered and empty, a window pane broken, roof sagging. Memories surged. Cold nights, wind whistling through cracks. The long years of solitude. Naomi trembled, but Thomas tugged at her shawl, pulling her back to the present. At the hilltop, the two graves lay, as ever. Naomi knelt, laying flowers before Samuel's marker, then gathered Thomas in her arms beside Emma's small resting place. The breeze carried the scent of new grass. "Samuel," she whispered, "I've kept my promise. I still remember you, and our child. But I've also learned how to live again. This is Thomas, my son with Elias. I named him to honor you. He will grow knowing that his mother's first husband was a brave man, and he will know how deeply I loved you." Tears fell, but they were no longer heavy with despair. Elias set his hand on her shoulder, bowing his head in quiet respect. Thomas, too young to understand, reached for the flowers and laughed aloud. His laughter rang across the hilltop like a call to life itself. Back in town, Naomi recognized many faces. Some still looked on with judgment, but others softened, as if admitting she had endured more than they could know. Then Martha Collins, her old friend, rushed forward and embraced her tightly. "Naomi, you've changed so much. I always knew you'd find your way." Naomi returned the embrace, gratitude swelling. Martha looked down at Thomas, smiling gently, a true little angel. That day, as the wagon rolled out of Dry Creek, Naomi glanced back one last time. The town no longer seemed a prison of memory, but simply a chapter closed. Beside her sat Elias and Thomas, her present, her future. She whispered softly, sending her words on the wind toward the hill behind. "Thank you. Because of you, I had the strength to go on. But now I will live for this child, and for the love I've found again." The spring sky spread clear and blue. The road ahead lay wide and open, carrying the three of them into a journey, not just survival, but true living. Some journeys are not to go far, but to return to oneself. Naomi had endured winters of loss, had believed her heart frozen forever. Yet because she opened the door that stormy night, she found Elias, and together they wrote a new spring. Now, standing beside Samuel and Emma's graves, she no longer wept in defeat. She smiled, knowing love never dies, it only changes shape, guiding us from surviving to living. Naomi's story is no fairy tale. It is a quiet reminder. At any age, a heart can awaken, and peace can be found. Dear friends, if this story has touched some corner of your memory or stirred your heart, please share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, so together we may continue to hear more tales of love in the Wild West stories that do not only speak of the past, but shine light upon the present. What do you think? Does love ever come too late? Or does it only come when we are brave enough to open our hearts?